Welcome to Chapter 4 on tissues. The definition of tissues is cells that look similar and work together to have a function. Histology is the study of tissues, and always go back to the big picture question. What types of tissues are there? There are only 4 basic types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural. Remember, this tissue level is the next level of organization after the cellular level. And these tissues, remember, 4 different types: epithelial. Epithelial tissues cover surfaces, line passageways, and are glandular tissues. Connective tissues fill spaces, provide support, and store energy. Muscle tissues contract to produce movement, and neural tissues carry information through electrical impulses. Epithelial tissues is a diverse category. Epithelia cover exposed surfaces, such as your skin, and line internal cavities and passageways, such as your mouth and nasal passageways. They often contain secretory cells or gland cells, so they secrete. These glands are divided into 2 types. The first type secretes through a tube or duct that opens up to the surface. An example would be sweat gland. Sweat glands are in the skin and secrete this sweat through a duct that opens out to the surface of the skin. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream. An example would be the pancreas. The functions of epithelial tissue include providing physical protection, controlling permeability, providing sensation, and producing secretions. Epithelial tissues are like these tiles on the floor. They are very close together. They're anchored to the surface beneath them. They are attached to each other. They can be wide, and it covers a wide surface, and they can be fairly flat. So, epithelial tissues are widespread, cover organs, line body surfaces. Epithelial tissues are anchored at the base, just like these tiles are glued on. They have cells that are tightly packed. These tiles are grouted together. They are avascular, which means they do not have a blood supply, and they're replaced frequently. This means they undergo mitosis rapidly. Some basic features. Just like the tiles on the floor have a free surface, the air above them, epithelial tissues have a free surface. It's called the apical surface. Microvilli are in the digestive tract. Cilia are often found in certain areas, such as the respiratory tract. And that apical surface faces the lumen. A lumen is just the opening. Epithelial cells are attached at the base. Epithelial cells can be classified by structure. They can be thin, they can look like cubes, or they can look like rectangular boxes. Those terms are squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Epithelial tissues are also classified by number of layers. A single layer is simple, several layers are stratified. Epithelial cells are connected to each other. There are many different types of connections to form a complete covering or lining. They can replace damaged or lost cells, and they lack blood vessels. They are avascular. This animation, intercellular connections, will be in Moodle. This slide talks about the ways that these epithelial tissues are connected to each other. First, there are tight connections that form a barrier so that isolates the basolateral surface and deeper tissues from the contents of the lumen. So here we are at a surface area. Let's say we're inside the small intestine. The small intestine's surface is covered with these microvilli. Here's the lumen, the apical surface. It's the opening. Lumen is the opening of the small intestine. So this is more superficial and this is deep. So you have to isolate what's in the lumen from the cells beneath it. And that's what that tight junction is going to do. An adhesion block locks together the terminal webs. You may recall that there are certain proteins that form a terminal web to give that cell some kind of structure. Well, this adhesion belt will lock those terminal webs together of neighboring cells. And this is going to prevent any leakage. Gap junctions, and you can see by the figure here that there are openings between those gap junctions. They permit chemical communication from one cell to another. Desmosomes provide firm attachment. So this is to strengthen the cellular connection from one cell to another. If you've ever had a sunburn that has peeled off in layers, that layer of cells is held together by those desmosomes. A hemidesmosome attaches the deepest epithelial cells to the basal lamina. Now, we haven't talked yet about the basal lamina. The basal lamina, also called the basement membrane, is what I call it the glue that holds the epithelial to the underlying tissue. It's a complex structure produced by the basal surface of the epithelium and the underlying connective tissue. So here is a clear layer, or lamina lucida, contains glycoproteins and a network of fine protein fibers, and then a dense layer, or lamina densa, containing bundles of coarse protein fibers. So this is going to provide the strength, and it acts as a filter to restrict diffusion between the adjacent tissues and the epithelium. Here's a close-up of the desmosomes. And this is what's going to attach epithelial cells to the nearby cells. These cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, are proteins between the membranes that bind one membrane to the next membrane. There can also be a type of intercellular cement, some proteoglycans. That's probably the most important part there. So remember, we can classify our epithelia by shape. And our first shape will be the flat shape, simple squamous epithelium. Simple refers to the fact that it's a single layer. So when you have a single layer of cells, there's no protection there. It is mainly for diffusion. So we're going to see this simple squamous epithelium. It is our capillaries. Our capillaries are simple squamous epithelium, a single layer of cells. The alveoli of the lungs, the air sacs, are a single layer of cells. And we're going to find these where a slippery surface is required to reduce friction. So lining it's given special names depending on where it's located. So lining the ventral body cavity is the mesothelium, and lining the heart and blood vessels is the endothelium. Those are all simple squamous epithelia. So here's a picture of, this is what this picture, like the surface view, is what you would see if you were to scrape your cheeks and pull off an entire layer. Usually when we scrape our cheeks and look at them in the cells under the microscope, they're separated from each other because those desmosomes holding the cells together have been broken. But here's this single layer of cells. So the endothelium lines the heart and blood vessels, and the mesothelium lines the pericardial cavity and the peritoneal cavity. Squamous can also be stratified, so here we see many layers of squamous cells. And so you're going to see layers where you need some kind of protection, where there's rubbing or abrasion where the outer cells will be lost, and the deeper cells will divide to replace those outer cells. We will find these in areas such as the skin, mouth, throat, esophagus, rectum, anus, and vagina. And these areas are mucous membrane, producing mucus to keep those tissues moist. So stratified squamous consists of two types, whether or not they contain the protein keratin. Keratin is our water-resistant protein. Our outer layer of cells of our skin are filled with keratin. Those outer cells are actually dead, but the keratin waterproofs and toughens the skin. And inside the mouth, think of where it's mucous membrane, it's non-keratinized, where it can dry out. So it has to stay moist. So the surface of the skin would contain keratinized skin cells, and you can see those keratin fibers. They're kind of twisted like heavy ropes, these fibers, for strength and also for waterproofing. Our second type of epithelial is cuboidal. First was squamous, we had simple and stratified, and now we have cuboidal. And if you look closely, you can see the lumen, and that it is surrounded by square-like cells. Or they look kind of roundish, but they're considered to be box-like cells. And all the nuclei are kind of located at the same distance. This is the kidney here, and inside the kidney are structures called nephrons, and these nephron tubules are made up of simple cuboidal epithelia. They kind of look like beads on a string when you look at them. Another type of epithelium is transitional. This is a little bit odd. This kind of tissue is built for stretch. So it's going to be filling our bladder, which needs to stretch when it's filled with urine. So it will look different when it's relaxed versus when it is stretched out. So transitional is for stretch. Simple columnar look like long, tall cells. Most of the nuclei are at about the same level. We find these simple columnar, a single layer of column-shaped cells in the stomach, the intestines, the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes or oviducts, and in the kidney ducts. Pseudo-stratified columnar. Pseudo means fake, maybe. So it looks stratified, but isn't. And these, instead of having all of the cells look the same height, these will vary. And often they are ciliated. So we will find these in areas, passageways of our respiratory system. So you can see the cilia on those. You can see all the nuclei are kind of bouncing around. They're not all in one row. Stratified columnar in the salivary duct. These are pretty rare. Not too much to say about those.